So thank you everyone for joining us this morning. I'd like to welcome you all to our first webinar series. In this series, our team at Lanturn, alongside experts in the industry, will be sharing why your fund or company should be set up in Singapore. So we hope these webinars will give you insight into the current business climate in Singapore. And this morning, we'll be focusing on why Singapore is an ideal place to set up your company. Attendees can ask questions at any point during the webinar through typing in the Q&A chat box. We'll be addressing the questions within the conversation or at the end of the webinar. So firstly, I'm Francesca. I'm the head of sales at Lanturn. I've worked in the corporate services industry for over 6 years, and I'll be the host for this webinar series. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce our 3 speakers today. So firstly, Simon co-founded and leads Click2View, a Singapore-based 30-person content marketing agency, delivering content strategy, creation, and amplification. Prior to setting up Click2View, Simon worked as a journalist for publications such as the Sunday Telegraph and the Australian. In addition to Click2View, Simon is the treasurer of the Asia Content Marketing Association, a peer-to-peer networking organization for content marketers in Asia. Also joining us is Tiang. Tiang is a startup operator and venture investor who partners with early-stage startup founders to build impactful businesses and enduring companies, drawing upon his experiences from Jungle Ventures, Evernote, and Stream Media. Tiang is currently the co-founder and partner of Forge Ventures, a seed-stage venture capital firm building the future in Southeast Asia. Finally, we have Chris joining us. Chris is the CFO and head of fund services at Lanturn. Chris has 9 years international experience in financial audit and financial management, and has worked in South Africa, the USA, UAE, and Singapore. Prior to joining Lanturn, Chris spent 3 years working at a Big Four audit firm, and was later the finance manager for a multinational reseller of petroleum products. Chris has an honours degree in accounting and finance and is a chartered accountant. So thank you to all of the speakers for joining us, and we're looking forward to hearing your insight into these topics. And I wanted to start off with quite a broad question. Many of our participants are based abroad and may not have had experience working in Singapore. So my first question would be, how does Singapore compare to other countries for doing business? Perhaps, Simon, we could get your input first.
Sure. Thanks, Francesca, and thanks for having me today. It's very nice to be here. How does Singapore compare to other countries for doing business? I think, a lot of people buy into the Singapore story and the Asia story, the Asia growth story. And Singapore, what I find is, over and above the ease of doing business, which everyone knows about, how government interactions are largely transparent and easy, and there's not much red tape and so forth. I think the thing about Singapore is that they're very, very proactive about making things easier. It's almost a constant process where you go to do something with a government agency, for instance, or you have to file your tax or log in with your SingPass. And you realize, oh, they've done something to make it even easier. So, I mean, the thing that's happened, I guess, in the last year is accessing your what's called a corp pass, which is basically your sort of, your business ID. And these days, you log into a government agency, you don't even have to remember any passwords or anything like that. It comes up with a QR code, you grab your phone, you scan in with your SingPass app, and then it comes up with a list of entities. You click on the entity that you want to interact with, and it's job done. And I think that's amazing to me as an Australian, interacting with your government so in such a simple and easy fashion. But the other thing is that Singapore seems to, they seem to really have overcome the idea of bureaucracy. They're actually sort of quite proactive, and they're building a really cool user experience for a business. And I'm fascinated to know how they do that, because usually in a sort of public service setting, there's all sorts of impediments to being at the front, to making things easy, to simplifying processes. It's quite the opposite often. So I think that's probably the number one thing I like about Singapore. That it's easy to do business, but they're making it even easier, which is remarkable.
Thank you very much, Simon, for your input. Tiang, do you have anything on to add on to that?
Yeah, no. So that definitely is very on point. So to echo Simon's thoughts, this is it's amazing how Singapore has really tried to strive to make it a lot easier for businesses in general, right? My context here as a startup venture investor, it's through that lens, it's looking at how they've been really proactive in helping startups and innovation thrive within the Singaporean environment. And I think that's especially true when you really came through during the pandemic period. So for context here, I'm a VC investor with regional investments across the region in Southeast Asia, in Singapore, in Indonesia, and in Vietnam, right? And what I saw, the difference for Singapore through that period was how proactive they are in making sure that small businesses are able to cope with the pandemic, right? And it's in a really proactive fashion, whether it's in terms of financial support, tax breaks, or just generally making sure that everyone's healthy at the workplace. Can't say the same for other regimes, but here in Singapore, that's almost taken like a given, right? For instance, so I always tell my my portfolio founders who are based here in Singapore how lucky they are, compared to their counterparts in Malaysia and in Indonesia, for instance, right? Because so much of the plumbing work, if I could elaborate that, has been taken care of, and on top of that, of course, the ease of doing business, the predictability in tax structures, regimes, and just make it so much easier, right, to do business. And that's something that you do not want to worry about when you're building a business from day to day. When you're out there building a startup, you do not want to worry about taxes, safety. I think that's a huge plus. So.
Thank you, Tiang, for your input there. Yes, I definitely agree. The infrastructure that the government set up really helped businesses through the pandemic. You mentioned briefly about the tax regimes, and I'd just like to go into more detail on that topic. Perhaps, Chris, you can give us more insight about the tax benefits of setting up a new company in Singapore.
Yeah, thanks, Francesca. So I think the main thing which applies to all companies in Singapore is there's a low income tax rate. There's no capital gains tax. And then I think, as mentioned before, Singapore has a stable regime and they make it very easy to use all of their websites. Their communication with the authorities is very easy. They also do have relatively simple tax regulations and compliance requirements compared to other countries around the world. I know whenever we speak to people from European countries, it always takes them a few minutes to kind of understand just how simple it is. And they will always say to me, like, really, it's only that's all that we need. So that's one of the good benefits for for moving to Singapore. Then it also just has double tax agreements with most of the major countries around the world. So you don't really need to worry about that too much. And then looking at starting up a company in Singapore, there's the startup tax exemption, which pretty much means you're getting 75% of your first $200,000 of taxable profit as exempt. If you are not a startup company, then this applies to every other company. You're still getting 50% of your first $200,000 of taxable income as exempt. And then I think finally, looking at setting up your regional headquarters or holding companies more specifically, your dividends are tax-free. So if your subsidiaries are operating profitably and are going to send dividends back to your holding company, those will be tax-free. There's no withholding tax that is required to be paid. And so that just means that you don't need to worry about any of those implications before you can declare your dividends onto your final shareholders. I think that's mainly it on the tax side of things. And just to say again, the value of having the stable regime is pretty important, especially when we compare it to other countries in the region where things can change quite quickly. I think in Singapore, they will announce changes that are going to happen many years in advance and then usually stick to those deadlines.
Thank you, Chris, for that insight. So there are definitely a lot of positives about doing business in Singapore, which we've discussed. However, speaking from experiences, what challenges do businesses face in Singapore at the current time? Simon, perhaps you can give your input on that first.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I guess, after you've been in Singapore for a while, complaining is a bit of a national sport, but talking about challenges is a bit like being on a super yacht and complaining about the caviar. It's, you know, it's pretty good. As Chris was saying, you know, stability, they telegraph changes, you know, well in advance. I think, you know, the only challenges I guess we face at the moment, if you can call them challenges, is that it's a tight, you know, it's a tight situation in terms of hiring, especially if we, you know, we want to bring in specific foreign talent. And I think the, you know, it's quite sort of boxed, like the roles and stuff like that are boxed. And we as a employer, we kind of like, you know, we see people and go, wow, you know, that person's great, I want to bring them in, and let's figure out a way to work with them. That doesn't quite work with the way that the hiring system works in Singapore, but that's, you know, that's a really small thing. I think salaries rising too, so there's sort of upward pressure on salaries at the moment, and we're seeing it with the, you know, the grads coming out and so forth. In fact, I was at a function the other day, and there's this a Singaporean chef with the Michelin star, this great restaurant called Labyrinth, which I haven't been to, but he's managing to sell Singaporean hawker food for $280 degustation menu. I don't know how he does that. He's paying his dishwasher $3,000 a month. So it's, you know, there's upward pressure on salaries. We're seeing that too with, you know, the young kids coming out of Poly and NUS, and the older guys in the office are, you know, they're quite like, they want, you know, they're saying they want what when they talk about their, you know, their starting salaries and so forth. So that's a challenge, but as I said, it's you know, it's a challenge in a very good environment for doing business.
Thank you very much, Simon. Yes, we've heard quite a lot of similar sentiments from our client base. Tiang, do you have anything to add on to that?
Yeah, so in the spirit of there's always room for improvement, I think, well, from my point of view, it's you know, again, as a venture investor, right? Startups here are looking at a pretty small domestic market, right? So if you're doing business here in Singapore, it really quickly run into a growth ceiling. So most of the time, I'll encourage startups here, or frankly, even, you know, just business owners here in general, right? To look at look at markets beyond Singaporean shores. So that's something that's definitely a very unique to Singapore in that regard. But the nice thing here is that because the audience here is pretty international, and there's pretty good connectivity to other markets from Singapore. So by and large, you know, I think that's something that's pretty easily solved for. But I do echo Simon's point around talent acquisition, right? Talent acquisition, it's getting really challenging across all fronts. You know, whether you're a technical personnel, non-technical personnel, given the relatively small talent pool that we're drawing from, especially today in a really competitive environment. It's something that, you know, recurringly I'm hearing that from startup founders, right? Which is across the board. unfortunately, I think I see that as a in the long run, I see that as a positive sign, right? It means that the ecosystem is growing, talent's being sought after, and there's capital being poured in to create new opportunities for everyone. Structurally, I think that will translate into always talent competition, and you see that everywhere, not just in Singapore, but also Silicon Valley, Australia, China, India, right? It's a global phenomenon. It's just it's a good sign, right? It's a good sign. So.
Thank you, Tiang, for that insight. So you did mention briefly that you have a lot of experience investing in other companies. So I was wondering, did you face any challenges whilst making those investments?
Well, of course. So compared to other regions, the infrastructure in Singapore, it's pretty robust, right? Generally, even if you're Indonesia or Vietnamese operating business, the tendency is for those companies to have a Singapore headquarter at HoldCo, for a couple of reasons. It's the infrastructure and the ecosystem of service providers here are pretty mature, right? So the ease of getting started in that regard is relatively inexpensive and easy and convenient. Secondly, more pertinent to venture-backed startups, investors are also pretty comfortable investing in a Singaporean structure. So it's created a pretty robust ecosystem to that effect. As you look at service providers, investors who are pretty comfortable with that structure, right, and it creates a pretty positive feedback loop in that regard, right. But that having been said, I think there's still a lot of work to be done, in my view. A lot of the investment structures, for instance, setting up a SPV for investment purposes, to the relatively young VCC structure in Singapore is still not well understood globally, and the relatively higher cost, right, of spinning up an investment business in Singapore compared to other regimes, that creates certain friction in bringing the feedback loop to the next level. And the other interesting thing here, it's slowly but surely Singapore is turning into a pretty vibrant Web3 crypto ecosystem hub, right? From even globally speaking, I think that's very much welcome. And if we're able to figure out a mature way to invite innovation, but at the same time protect consumer interests, that would definitely be something that's very welcome.
Thank you, Tiang. Yes, we've definitely seen a lot of interest in setting up crypto-related companies at Lanturn. So that's actually a topic for a future webinar. But thank you for your that we are going to host. But thank you for your insight there. And Simon, so I understand you bootstrapped your company without investment. How was your experience with that?
It was interesting. I think the thing, like, I had no idea about business when I started, so it's a really good thing I didn't take investment, because I would have squandered the whole lot and gone broke. But so I got the chance to make a lot of mistakes. I think that the insight about Singapore vis-a-vis Australia, where I'm from, or the UK, where my original business partner was from, was we had a very strong sense that Singapore was very open to doing business with a couple of newbies and an idea. There's an old joke in Singapore that how do you get to know everyone? You just network for 6 weeks and then you're an old hand. And that's pretty much, I think that's still true. So we were able to sort of run around town and do meetings and just basically put our shingle out, and people hired us, and so that we were able to bootstrap and actually pay ourselves from day one, which was great. And then then we got to learn by doing. and learn our business and make all those mistakes with our own money rather than other people's money. So I think that that was a really cool thing, and I sense from people who've I've been in Singapore for 14 years now, but I sense a lot of the people who have been here for a long time definitely want to pass that on. Like, if somebody new comes to town and they want to, they want to have a chat, even if they don't know me, and just contact me out of the blue, always happy to, to have a yarn about doing business here and, make introductions. And I find that across the board, which I think is really cool. It's like, it's a very, friendly, vibrant situation. And whereas I think being in the media and creative space, the sense in Australia was a slightly bit of a closed shop. You had to break in, do your time to get a start there, establish a reputation and something like that. So really cool to have that opportunity. Ironically, now looking at having a bit more understanding about the types of businesses that work, I think it's the investment environment in Singapore is really interesting as well, because there's a lot of money looking for a home in startups, which I think is great, and it's it's really exciting to be part of an entrepreneurial society.
Thank you for that, Simon. And yes, we definitely find Singapore is a very open place to do business, and a lot of the founders are that we see are first-time founders. So it leads quite well into the next question that we have, which is, what's one thing you would have done differently when setting up your company?
I'm muted. Yeah. I think well, I would have liked to have made less mistakes, but they, you learn from those. I think probably more processes. I'm very focused on designing the business now and making sure it works, and so more processes. Try and do a bit less less actual work myself, and focus on designing the business or coding the business, I suppose. And I think the other thing is, like, after a while, you realize you do have to follow those growth trends in business. You can't just ignore the cool things that are happening because you don't like them. So I'd be more focused on growth trends within my my particular sector.
Thank you, Simon, for that insight. Tiang, since you've invested in many businesses, perhaps you can advise from that angle in your experience working with other startups.
Yeah. So just one perhaps very mundane and banal piece of advice, which is, do not skim on service providers. Don't try to get the cheapest accountant, corpsec, lawyers. You pay peanuts, you get monkeys, right? And trust me, these are some of the most important components of business building that you could invest for the long term, because you just do not want to worry about these things, right? It's not value accrue. It doesn't accrue value to your core business. Just make sure that you get a high quality service provider and you're off to the races, right? I think sometimes there's a tendency for founders to think of it as a cost center, but I would like to invite everyone to really think of it as an investment for the long term rather. So
I think I'd echo that, Tiang. I mean, we nearly went broke thanks to a bad in-house accountant that we hired, and and when you don't realize it, but when your books become a mess and you're actually the CEO and you didn't realize that this was happening, it takes months, and it's such a pain to get yourself out of. So it's like, if you do it right at the start, it just makes life so much simpler. Yeah, very much agree with that.
Thanks, Simon and Tiang. Of course, we would be happy to agree that it's very important to pick your service provider carefully. So Yeah, I think moving on to a more practical question, I think some of our participants coming from abroad where there's kind of different software in the market, but is there any specific software that you use in your business operations that help improve your workflow? Simon, perhaps you can start with this question.
All right. Yeah, look, I mean, we use Xero for our accounts. Workflow Max, which is the Xero add-on project management tool, and which, like, I wouldn't say I was 100% happy with it, but we've tried dozens, and it's the only one that works for us and works well. So it's yeah. What were the other ones I wrote down? Google Workspace. So like we signed up with the Gmail initially, and it's it works really well. It's and they've just changed the workspace to have this chat and spaces and meet, and it's kind of all in one, and it travels across your devices and so forth. Google and Microsoft are both clients of ours. Sorry, Microsoft, but we signed up with them first, and it's too hard to change over. The Google Workspace works really well, and we do use the Drive a lot because we do have a lot of digital media. So we're using a lot of video files, animation files, and working with people all around the world. So transferring those files around the world works really well as well. And recently, I use all sorts of things. So like, I'm a mad Evernote note taker myself. That's where I do all my personal notes. But I use Notion a bit, which is a sort of like a quasi database plus note-taking tool. That's useful for certain things. And then just we're going through a reorganization process at the moment, and we're using Miro, and that's really cool to to work with ideas, work with visual ideas and structures on a page and share those between a group of people. Miro is like a sort of I guess it's a big canvas where you can just put charts and flow, organizational structures and notes and stuff like that.
Thank you, Simon. There's definitely some interesting software there. Yes, we're very familiar with using Xero in our operations as well, and Google Workspace works very well, and some new ones I hadn't heard of. So thank you for that. Jiang, do you have any other software that you use that you could mention?
Well, Simon, it brings a tear to my eye hearing the word Evernote coming out of here. So pretty similar stack, Google Workspace, Evernote for personal note-taking, Notion for more of like a team wiki, if you will. But one thing I'm trying to do a lot more of is to start building internal products, right? What I mean by that is I'm using low-code tools like Zapier, Airtable, Slack, right? Just to piece all these different software together and customize them to our pretty specific needs, right? In the running a VC firm. So whether that's a CRM for investors, whether that's a CRM for different investment opportunities that we're looking at, and also different kinds of marketing communication tools. It's I always muse to myself, it's such a great time to be alive because there's an abundance of these tools that allow me a very high degree of flexibility in building and customizing software to suit my very peculiar needs, right? So.
Thank you so much, Chang. I think a lot of practical advice there. So my final question, and we've kind of covered a lot about it in the webinar so far, but I would ask for one final piece of advice for new business owners in Singapore. Yes, Simon, if you could perhaps start with that question.
Oh, okay, sure. I think you have to be on the ground. Even post-pandemic, I think you you get a lot of kudos for being on the ground, especially if you're the founder. If you're the founder and you're not on the ground in Singapore, you need to put somebody here who's going to establish themselves and be committed. I don't think Singapore works very well with sort of the fly in, fly out CEO. People really appreciate that you're committed to the market, and you're putting down roots here, and you're here for the long haul. I mean, I can't count the number of times that an Australian agency, in similar business to ours, is, a friend of a friend said, "Oh, such and such, they're coming up here and they think they're going to come in 1 week a month and they're going to, they're going to slay it." It's like, yeah, sure. And I sit down with them and I tell them what I think, and none of them are here now. So that it doesn't work like that with Singapore. So I think you have to be on the ground, and then, stick with it.
Thank you, Simon. Tiang, do you have anything to add on?
No, I think that's a particularly great advice. I think I tend to think of business building as not just creating a business, but really building a company, right? And what that means is being part of the community around you, because at the end of the day, a company is a reflection of the community it's born out of, right? So whether it's the customers you're serving, whether it's the team that you're building, you're recruiting from the community, and it warrants investment in time and effort and energy, like what Simon's outlined, right? So I think that's a particularly long-term view to take, and I think it's an important view to take too.
Thank you, Tiang, and that was my final question. So thanks very much to all of the speakers, Tiang, Simon, Chris, for joining us today and sharing your insights. Yeah, I'm sure our participants got a lot of valuable advice. So thank you. We will end the webinar here. Just like to say that we will be hosting more webinars in the future, and you can keep up to date with them through our social media, our website, and our LinkedIn page. And yes, please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions based on the webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
for having
everyone.
us.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.